Section 17. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. First Division. Transcendental Analytic. Book 2. Transcendental Doctrine of the Faculty of Judgment, or Analytic of Principles. Chapter 3. Of the ground of the division of all objects into phenomena and noumena.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Cho. The Critique of Pure Reason, by Immanuel Kant, Section 7. Chapter 3. Of the ground of the division of all objects into phenomena and noumena. We have now not only traversed the region of the pure understanding and carefully surveyed every part of it, but we have also measured it and assigned to everything therein its proper place. But this land is an island, and enclosed by nature herself within unchangeable limits. It is the land of truth, an attractive word, surrounded by a wide and stormy ocean, the region of illusion, where many a fog bank, many an iceberg, seems to the mariner, on his voyage of discovery, a new country, and, while constantly deluding him with vain hopes, engages him in dangerous adventures, from which he never can desist, and which yet he never can bring to a termination. But before venturing upon this sea, in order to explore it in its whole extent, and to arrive at a certainty whether anything is to be discovered there, it will not be without advantage if we cast our eyes upon the chart of the land that we are about to leave, and to ask ourselves, firstly, whether we cannot rest perfectly contented with what it contains, or whether we must not of necessity be contented with it, if we can find nowhere else a solid foundation to build upon. And, secondly, by what title we possess this land itself, and how we hold it secure against all hostile claims. Although in the course of our analytic we have already given sufficient answers to these questions, yet a summary recapitulation of these solutions may be useful in strengthening our conviction, by uniting in one point the momenta of the arguments. We have seen that everything which the understanding draws from itself, without borrowing from experience, it nevertheless possesses only for the behoof and use of experience. The principles of the pure understanding, whether constitutive a priori, as the mathematical principles, or merely regulative, as the dynamical, contain nothing but the pure schema, as it were, of possible experience. For experience possesses its unity from the synthetical unity which the understanding, originally and from itself, imparts to the synthesis of the imagination in relation to apperception, and in a priori relation to and agreement with which phenomena, as data for a possible cognition, must stand. But although these rules of the understanding are not only a priori true, but the very source of all truth, that is, of the accordance of our cognition with objects, and on this ground that they contain the basis of the possibility of experience, as the ensemble of all cognition, it seems to us not enough to propound what is true. We desire also to be told what we want to know. If, then, we learn nothing more by this critical examination than what we should have practiced in the merely empirical use of the understanding, without any such subtle inquiry, the presumption is that the advantage we reap from it is not worth the labor bestowed upon it. It may certainly be answered that no rash curiosity is more prejudicial to the enlargement of our knowledge than that which must know beforehand the utility of this or that piece of information which we seek, before we have entered on the needful investigations, and before one could form the least conception of its utility, even though it were placed before our eyes. But there is one advantage in such transcendental inquiries which can be made comprehensible to the dullest and most reluctant learner. This, namely, that the understanding which is occupied merely with empirical exercise and does not reflect on the sources of its own cognition, may exercise its functions very well and very successfully, but is quite unable to do one thing, and that of very great importance, to determine, namely, the bounds that limit its employment, and to know what lies within or without its own sphere. This purpose can be obtained only by such profound investigations as we have instituted. But if it cannot distinguish whether certain questions lie within its horizon or not, it can never be sure either as to its claims or possessions, but must lay its account with many humiliating corrections when it transgresses, as it unavoidably will, the limits of its own territory, and loses itself in fanciful opinions and blinding illusions. That the understanding, therefore, cannot make of its a priori principles, or even of its conceptions, other than an empirical use, is a proposition which leads to the most important results. A transcendental use is made of a conception in a fundamental proposition or principle, when it is referred to things in general and considered as things in themselves. An empirical use when it is referred merely to phenomena, that is, to objects of a possible experience. That the latter use of a conception is the only admissible one is evident from the reasons following. For every conception are requisite, firstly, the logical form of a conception, of thought general, and, secondly, the possibility of presenting to this an object to which it may apply. Failing this latter, it has no sense, and utterly void of content, although it may contain the logical function for constructing a conception from certain data. Now, object cannot be given to a conception otherwise than by intuition, and even if a pure intuition antecedent to the object is a priori possible, this pure intuition can itself obtain objective validity only from empirical intuition, of which it is itself but the form. All conceptions, therefore, and with them all principles, however high the degree of their a priori possibility, relate to empirical intuitions, that is, to data towards a possible experience. Without this, they possess no objective validity, but are mere play of imagination or of understanding with images or notions. Let us take, for example, the conceptions of mathematics, and first in its pure intuitions. Space has 3 dimensions. Between 2 points there can be only one straight line, etc. Although all these principles and the representation of the object with which this science occupies itself are generated in the mind entirely a priori, they would nevertheless have no significance if we were not always able to exhibit their significance in and by means of phenomena, empirical objects. Hence, it is requisite that an abstract conception be made sensuous, that is, that an object corresponding to it in intuition be forthcoming. Otherwise, the conception remains, as we say, without sense, that is, without meaning. Mathematics fulfills this requirement by the construction of the figure, which is a phenomenon evident to the senses. The same science finds support and significance in number. This, in turn, finds it in the fingers, or in counters, or in lines and points. The conception itself is always produced a priori, together with the synthetical principles or formulas from such conceptions. But the proper employment of them, and their application to objects, can exist nowhere but in experience, the possibility of which, as regards its form, they contain a priori. That this is also the case with all of the categories and the principles based upon them is evident from the fact that we cannot render intelligible the possibility of an object corresponding to them without having recourse to the conditions of sensibility. Consequently, to the form of phenomena, to which, as their only proper objects, their use must therefore be confined, inasmuch as, if this condition is removed, all significance, that is, all relation to an object, disappears, and no example can be found to make it comprehensible what sort of things we ought to think under such conceptions. The conception of quantity cannot be explained except by saying that it is the determination of a thing whereby it can be cogitated how many times one is placed in it. But this how many times is based upon successive repetition, consequently upon time and the synthesis of the homogeneous therein. Reality, in contradistinction to negation, can be explained only by cogitating a time which is either filled therewith or is void. If I leave out the notion of permanence, which is existence in all time, there remains in the conception of substance nothing but the logical notion of subject, a notion of which I endeavor to realize by representing to myself something that can exist only as a subject. But not only am I perfectly ignorant of any conditions under which this logical prerogative can belong to a thing, I can make nothing out of the notion and draw no inference from it, because no object to which to apply the conception is determined, and we consequently do not know whether it has any meaning at all. In like manner, if I leave out the notion of time, in which something follows upon some other thing in conformity with a rule, I can find nothing in the pure category, except that there is a something of such a sort that from it a conclusion may be drawn as to the existence of some other thing. But in this case it would not only be impossible to distinguish between a cause and an effect, but, as this power to draw conclusions requires conditions of which I am quite ignorant, the conception is not determined as to the mode in which it ought to apply to an object. The so-called principle, everything that is contingent has a cause, comes with a gravity and self-assumed authority that seems to require no support from without. But, I ask, what is meant by contingent? The answer is that the non-existence of which is possible. But I should like very well to know by what means this possibility of non-existence is to be cognized, if we do not represent to ourselves succession in the series of phenomena, and in this succession an existence which follows a non-existence, or conversely, consequently, change. For to say that the non-existence of a thing is not self-contradictory is a lame appeal to a logical condition, which is no doubt a necessary condition of the existence of the conception, but is far from being sufficient for the real objective possibility of non-existence. I can annihilate in thought every existing substance without self-contradiction, but I cannot infer from this their objective contingency in existence, that is to say, the possibility of their non-existence in itself. As regards the category of community, it may easily be inferred that, as the pure categories of substance and causality are incapable of a definition and explanation sufficient to determine their object without the aid of intuition, the category of reciprocal causality and the relation of substances to each other, commercium, is just as little susceptible thereof. Possibility, existence, and necessity nobody has ever yet been able to explain without being guilty of manifest tautology, when the definition has been drawn entirely from the pure understanding. For the substitution of the logical possibility of the conception, the condition of which is that it be not self-contradictory, for the transcendental possibility of things, the condition of which is that there be an object corresponding to the conception, is a trick which can only deceive the inexperienced. Footnote 37. In one word, to none of these conceptions belongs a corresponding object, and consequently their real possibility cannot be demonstrated if we take away sensuous intuition, the only intuition which we possess, and there then remains nothing but the logical possibility, that is, the fact that the conception or thought is possible, which, however, is not the question. What we want to know being whether it relates to an object and thus possesses any meaning. Back to text. It follows incontestably that the pure conceptions of the understanding are incapable of transcendental, and must always be of empirical use alone, and that the principles of the pure understanding relate only to the general conditions of a possible experience, to objects of the senses, and never to things in general, apart from the mode in which we intuit them. Transcendental analytic has accordingly this important result, to wit, that the understanding is competence of fact nothing a priori, except the anticipation of the form of a possible experience in general, and that, as that which is not phenomenon cannot be an object of experience, it can never overstep the limits of sensibility, within which alone objects are presented to us. Its principles are merely principles of the exposition of phenomena, and the proud name of an ontology, which professes to present synthetical cognitions a priori of things in general in a systematic doctrine, must give place to the modest title of analytic of the pure understanding. Thought is the act of referring a given intuition to an object. If the mode of this intuition is unknown to us, the object is merely transcendental, and the conception of the understanding is employed only transcendentally, that is, to produce unity in the thought of a manifold in general. Now a pure category, in which all conditions of sensuous intuition, as the only intuition we possess, are abstracted, does not determine an object, but merely expresses the thought of an object in general, according to different modes. Now, to employ a conception, the function of judgment is required, by which an object is subsumed under the conception, consequently the at least formal condition under which something can be given in intuition. Failing this condition of judgment, schema, subsumption is impossible. For there is in such a case nothing given, which may be subsumed under the conception. The merely transcendental use of the categories is therefore, in fact, no use at all, and has no determined, or even, as regards its form, determinable object. Hence it follows that the pure category is incompetent to establish a synthetical a priori principle, and that the principles of the pure understanding are only of empirical and never of transcendental use, and that beyond the sphere of possible experience, no synthetical a priori principles are possible. It may be advisable, therefore, to express ourselves thus. The pure categories, apart from the formal conditions of sensibility, have a merely transcendental meaning, but are nevertheless not of transcendental use, because this is in itself impossible, inasmuch as all the conditions of any employment or use of them, in judgments, are absent, to wit, the formal conditions of the subsumption of an object under these conceptions. As, therefore, in the character of pure categories, they must be employed empirically, and cannot be employed transcendentally, they are of no use at all, when separated from sensibility, that is, they cannot be applied to an object. They are merely the pure form of the employment of the understanding in respect of objects in general and of thought, without its being at the same time possible to think or to determine any object by their means. But there lurks at the foundation of this subject an illusion which it is very difficult to avoid. The categories are not based, as regards their origin, upon sensibility, like the forms of intuition, space, and time. They seem, therefore, to be capable of an application beyond the sphere of sensuous objects. But this is not the case. They are nothing but mere forms of thought, which contain only the logical faculty of uniting a priori in consciousness the manifold given in intuition. Apart, then, from the only intuition possible for us, they have still less meaning than the pure sensuous forms, space and time, for through them an object is at least given, while a mode of connection of the manifold, when the intuition which alone gives the manifold is wanting, has no meaning at all. At the same time, when we designate certain objects as phenomena or sensuous existences, thus distinguishing our mode of intuiting them from their own nature as things in themselves, It is evident that by this very distinction we as it were place the latter, considered in this their own nature, although we do not so intuit them, in opposition to the former, or, on the other hand, we do so place other possible things, which are not objects of our senses, but are cogitated by the understanding alone, and call them intelligible existences, noumena. Now the question arises whether the pure conceptions of our understanding do possess significance in respect of these latter, and may possibly be a mode of cognizing them. But we are met at the very commencement with an ambiguity, which may easily occasion great misapprehension. The understanding, when it terms an object in a certain relation phenomenon, at the same time forms out of this relation a representation or notion of an object in itself, and hence believes that it can form also conceptions of such objects. Now as the understanding possesses no other fundamental conceptions besides the categories, it takes for granted that an object considered as a thing in itself must be capable of being thought by means of these pure conceptions, and is thereby led to hold the perfectly undetermined conception of an intelligible existence, as something out of the sphere of our sensibility. For a determinate conception of an existence which we can cognize in some way or other by means of the understanding. If, by the term noumenon, we understand a thing so far as it is not an object of our sensuous intuition, thus making abstraction of our mode of intuiting it, this is a noumenon in the negative sense of the word. But if we understand by it an object of a non-sensuous intuition, we in this case assume a peculiar mode of intuition, an intellectual intuition, to wit, which does not, however, belong to us, of the very possibility of which we have no notion, and this is a noumenon in the positive sense. The doctrine of sensibility is also the doctrine of noumenon in the negative sense, that is, of things which the understanding is obliged to cogitate apart from any relation to our mode of intuition, consequently not as mere phenomena, but as things in themselves. But the understanding at the same time comprehends that it cannot employ its categories for the consideration of things in themselves, because these possess significance only in relation to the unity of intuitions in space and time, and that they are competent to determine this unity by means of general a priori connecting conceptions only on account of the pure ideality of space and time. Where this unity of time is not to be met with, as is the case with noumena, the whole use, indeed the whole meaning of the categories is entirely lost, for even the possibility of things to correspond to the categories is in this case incomprehensible. On this point I need only refer the reader to what I have said at the commencement of the general remark appended to the foregoing chapter. Now, the possibility of a thing can never be proved from the fact that the conception of it is not self-contradictory, but only by means of an intuition corresponding to the conception. If, therefore, we wish to apply the categories to objects which cannot be regarded as phenomena, we must have an intuition different from the sensuous, and in this case the objects would be a noumena in the positive sense of the word. Now, as such an intuition, that is, an intellectual intuition, is no part of our faculty of cognition, it is absolutely impossible for the categories to possess any application beyond the limits of experience. It may be true that there are intelligible existences to which our faculty of sensuous intuition has no relation and cannot be applied, but our conceptions of the understanding, as mere forms of thought for our sensuous intuition, do not extend to these. What, therefore, we call noumenon must be understood by us as such in a negative sense. If I take away from an empirical intuition all thought, by means of the categories, there remains no cognition of any object. For by means of mere intuition nothing is cogitated, and from the existence of such or such an affection of sensibility in me, it does not follow that this affection or representation has any relation to an object without me. But if I take away all intuition, there still remains the form of thought, that is, the mode of determining an object for the manifold of a possible intuition. Thus, the categories do, in some measure, really extend further than sensuous intuition, inasmuch as they think objects in general, without regard to the mode of sensibility in which these objects are given. But they do not for this reason apply to and determine a wider sphere of objects, because we cannot assume that such can be given, without presupposing the possibility of another than the sensuous mode of intuition, a supposition we are not justified in making. I call a conception problematical which contains in itself no contradiction, and which is connected with other cognitions as a limitation of given conceptions, but whose objective reality cannot be cognized in any manner. The conception of a noumenon, that is, of a thing which must be cogitated not as an object of sense, but as a thing in itself, solely through the pure understanding, is not self-contradictory, for we are not entitled to maintain that sensibility is the only possible mode of intuition. Nay, further, this conception is necessary to restrain sensuous intuition within the bounds of phenomena, and thus to limit the objective validity of sensuous cognition. For things in themselves, which lie beyond its province, are called noumena for the very purpose of indicating that this cognition does not extend its application to all that the understanding thinks. But, after all, the possibility of such noumena is quite incomprehensible, and beyond the sphere of phenomena. All is for us a mere void. That is to say, we possess an understanding whose province does problematically extend beyond the sphere, but we do not possess an intuition, indeed, not even the conception of a possible intuition, by means of which objects beyond the region of sensibility could be given us, and in reference to which the understanding might be employed assertorically. The conception of a noumenon is therefore merely a limitative conception, and therefore only of negative use. But it is not an arbitrary or fictitious notion, but is connected with the limitation of sensibility, without, however, being capable of presenting us with any positive datum beyond this sphere. The division of objects into phenomena and noumena, and of the world into a mundus sensibilis and intelligibilis, is therefore quite inadmissible in a positive sense, although conceptions do certainly admit of such a division. For the class of noumena have no determinate object corresponding to them, and cannot therefore possess objective validity. If we abandon the senses, how can it be made conceivable that the categories, which are the only conceptions that could serve as conceptions for noumena, have any sense or meaning at all, inasmuch as something more than the mere unity of thought, namely a possible intuition, is requisite for their application to an object? The conception of a noumenon, considered as merely problematical, is, however, not only admissible, but, as a limitative conception of sensibility, absolutely necessary. But in this case, a noumenon is not a particular intelligible object for our understanding. On the contrary, the kind of understanding to which it could belong is itself a problem, for we cannot form the most distant conception of the possibility of an understanding which should cognize an object, not discursively by means of categories, but intuitively in a non-sensuous intuition. Our understanding attains in this way a sort of negative extension. That is to say, it is not limited by, but rather limits, sensibility, by giving the name of noumena to things, not considered as phenomena, but as things in themselves. But it at the same time prescribes limits to itself, for it confesses itself unable to cognize these by means of the categories, and hence is compelled to cogitate them merely as an unknown something. I find, however, in the writings of modern authors, an entirely different use of the expressions mundus sensibilis and intelligibilis, which quite departs from the meaning of the ancients, an acceptation in which, indeed, there is to be found no difficulty, but which at the same time depends on mere verbal quibbling. According to this meaning, some have chosen to call the complex of phenomena, in so far as it is intuited, mundus sensibilis, but in so far as the connection thereof is cogitated according to general laws of thought, mundus intelligibilis. Astronomy, in so far as we mean by the word the mere observation of the starry heaven, may represent the former, a system of astronomy, such as the Copernican or Newtonian, the latter. But such twisting of words is a mere sophistical subterfuge to avoid a difficult question, by modifying its meaning to suit our own convenience. To be sure, understanding and reason are employed in the cognition of phenomena, but the question is, whether these can be applied when the object is not a phenomenon, and in this sense we regard it, if it is cogitated, as given to the understanding alone, and not to the senses. The question, therefore, is whether, over and above the empirical use of the understanding, a transcendental use is possible, which applies to the noumenon as an object. This question we have answered in the negative. When, therefore, we say the senses represent objects as they appear, the understanding as they are, the latter statement must not be understood in a transcendental, but only in an empirical signification, that is, as they must be represented in the complete connection of phenomena, and not according to what they may be, apart from their relation to possible experience, consequently not as objects of the pure understanding. For this must ever remain unknown to us. Nay, it is also quite unknown to us whether any such transcendental or extraordinary cognition is possible under any circumstances, at least whether it is possible by means of our categories. Understanding and sensibility, with us, can determine objects only in conjunction. If we separate them, we have intuitions without conceptions, or conceptions without intuitions. In both cases, representations, which we cannot apply to any determinate object. If, after all our inquiries and explanations, anyone still hesitates to abandon the mere transcendental use of the categories, let him attempt to construct with them a synthetical proposition. It would, of course, be unnecessary for this purpose to construct an analytical proposition, for that does not extend the sphere of the understanding. But, being concerned only about what is cogitated in the conception itself, it leaves it quite undecided whether the conception has any relation to objects, or merely indicates the unity of thought, complete abstraction being made of the modi in which an object may be given. In such a proposition, it is sufficient for the understanding to know what lies in the conception, to what it applies is to it indifferent. The attempt must therefore be made with a synthetical and so-called transcendental principle. For example, everything that exists, exists as substance. Or, everything that is contingent exists as an effect of some other thing, videlicet, of its cause. Now I ask, whence can the understanding draw these synthetical propositions when the conceptions contained therein do not relate to possible experience, but to things in themselves, noumena? Where is it to be found the third term, which is always requisite pure sight in a synthetical proposition, which may connect in the same proposition conceptions which have no logical, analytical, connection with each other? The proposition never will be demonstrated, nay, more, the possibility of any such pure assertion never can be shown, without making reference to the empirical use of the understanding, and thus, ipso facto, completely renouncing pure and non-sensuous judgment. Thus, the conception of pure and merely intelligible objects is completely void of all principles of its application, because we cannot imagine any mode in which they might be given, and the problematical thought which leaves a place open for them serves only, like a void space, to limit the use of empirical principles, without containing at the same time any other object of cognition beyond their sphere. End of section 7.
Section 18. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel.
But we are met at the very commencement with an ambiguity, which may easily occasion great misapprehension.
Transcendental Logic. First Division. Transcendental Analytic. Book 2. Transcendental Doctrine of the Faculty of Judgment, or Analytic of Principles.
This reading by Carl Manchester, 2007. Of the equivocal nature or amphiboly of the conceptions of reflection from the confusion of the transcendental with the empirical use of the understanding. Reflection, reflexio, is not occupied about objects themselves for the purpose of directly obtaining conceptions of them, but is that state of the mind in which we set ourselves to discover the subjective conditions under which we obtain conceptions. It is the consciousness of the relation of given representations to the different sources or faculties of cognition, by which alone their relation to each other can be rightly determined. The first question which occurs in considering our representations is to what faculty of cognition do they belong? To the understanding or to the senses? Many judgments are admitted to be true from mere habit or inclination, but, because reflection neither precedes nor follows, it is held to be a judgment that has its origins in the understanding. All judgments do not require examination, that is, investigation into the grounds of their truth. For, when they are immediately certain, for example, between 2 points there can be only one straight line, no better or less mediate test of their truth can be found than that which they themselves contain and express. But all judgment, nay, all comparisons, require reflection, that is, a distinction of the faculty of cognition to which the given conceptions belong. The act whereby I compare my representations with the faculty of cognition which originates them, and whereby I distinguish whether they are compared with each other as belonging to the pure understanding or to sensuous intuition, I term transcendental reflection. Now, the relations in which conceptions can stand to each other are those of identity and difference, agreement and opposition of the internal and external, finally of the determinable and the determining, matter and form. The proper determination of these relations rests on the question to what faculty of cognition they subjectively belong, whether to sensibility or understanding. For on the manner in which we solve this question depends the manner in which we must cogitate these relations. Before constructing any objective judgment, we compare the conceptions that are to be placed in the judgment, and observe whether there exists identity of many representations in one conception, if a general judgment is to be constructed, or difference if a particular, whether there is agreement when affirmative and opposition when negative judgments are to be constructed, and so on. For this reason we ought to call these conceptions conceptions of comparison, conceptus comparationis. But as when the question is not to the logical form, but as to the content of conceptions, that is to say, whether the things themselves are identical or different, in agreement or opposition, and so on, the things can have a twofold relation to our faculty of cognition, to wit, a relation either to sensibility or to the understanding, and as on this relation depends their relation to each other. Transcendental reflection, that is, the relation of given representations to one or the other faculty of cognition, can alone determine this latter relation. Thus we shall not be able to discover whether the things are identical or different, in agreement or opposition, etc., from the mere conception of things by means of comparison, comparatio, but only by distinguishing the mode of cognition to which they belong, in other words, by means of transcendental reflection. We may, therefore, with justice say that logical reflection is mere comparison, for in it no account is taken of the faculty of cognition to which the given conceptions belong, and they are consequently, as far as regards their origin, to be treated as homogeneous, while transcendental reflection, which applies to the objects themselves, contains the ground of the possibility of objective comparison of representations with each other, and is therefore very different from the former, because the faculties of cognition to which they belong are not even the same. Transcendental reflection is a duty which no one can neglect who wishes to establish an a priori judgment upon things. We shall now proceed to fulfil this duty, and thereby throw not a little light on the question as to the determination of the proper business of the understanding. 1. Identity and difference. When an object is presented to us several times, but always with the same internal determinations, qualitas et quantitas, it, if an object of pure understanding, is always the same, not several things, but only one thing, numerica identitas. But if a phenomenon, we do not concern ourselves with comparing the conception of the thing with the conception of some other, but, although they may be in this respect perfectly the same, the difference of place at the same time is a sufficient grounds for asserting the numerical difference of these objects of sense. Thus, in the case of 2 drops of water, we may make complete abstraction of all internal differences, quality and quantity, and the fact that they are intuited at the same time in different places is sufficient to justify us in holding them to be numerically different. Leibniz regarded phenomena as things in themselves, consequently as intelligibilia, that is, objects of pure understanding, although on account of the confused nature of their representations he gave them the name of phenomena, and in this case his principle of the indiscernible, principium identitas indiscernibilum, is not to be impugned. But, as phenomena are objects of sensibility, and as the understanding in respect of them must be employed empirically and not purely or transcendentally, plurality and numerical difference are given by space itself as the condition of external phenomena. For one part of space, although it may be perfectly similar and equal to another part, is still without it, and for this reason alone is different from the latter, which is added to it in order to make up a greater space. It follows that this must hold good for all things that are in the different parts of space at the same time, however similar and equal one may be to another. 2. Agreement and opposition. When reality is represented by the pure understanding, realitas noumenon, opposition between realities is incogitable. Such a relation, that is, that when the realities are connected in one subject, they annihilate the effects of each other and may be represented in the formula 3 minus 3 equals 0. On the other hand, the real inner phenomena, realitas phenomenon, may very well be in mutual opposition and, when united in the same subject, the one may completely or in part annihilate the effect or consequence of the other, as in the case of 2 moving forces in the same straight line, drawing or impelling a point in opposite directions, or in the case of a pleasure counterbalancing a certain amount of pain. 3. The internal and external. In an object of the pure understanding, only that is internal which has no relation, as regards its existence, to anything different from itself. On the other hand, the internal determination of a substantia phenomenon in space are nothing but relations, and it is itself nothing more than a complex of mere relations. Substance in space we are cognizant of only through forces operative in it, either drawing others towards itself, attraction, or preventing others from forcing into itself, repulsion and impenetrability. We know no other properties that make up the conception of substance phenomenal in space, and which we term matter. On the other hand, as an object of the pure understanding, every substance must have an internal determination and forces. But what other internal attributes of such an object can I think than those which my internal sense presents to me? That, to wit, which is either itself thought, or something analogous to it. Hence Leibniz, who looked upon things as noumena, after denying them everything like external relation, and therefore also composition and combination, declared that all substances, even the component parts of matter, were simple substances with powers of representation, in one word, monads. 4. Matter and form. These 2 conceptions lie at the foundation of all other reflection, so inseparably are they connected with every mode of exercising the understanding. The former denotes the determinable in general, the second its determination, both in a transcendental sense, abstraction being made of every difference in that which is given, and of the mode in which it is determined. Logicians formerly termed the universal matter, the specific difference of this or that part of the universal form. In a judgment, one may call the given conceptions logical matter for the judgment, the relation of those to each other, by means of the copula, the form of the judgment. In an object, the composite parts thereof, essentialia, are the matter, the mode in which they are connected in the object, the form. In respect to things in general, unlimited reality was regarded as the matter of all possibility, the limitation thereof, negation, as the form, by which one thing is distinguished from another according to transcendental conceptions. The understanding demands that something be given, at least in the conception, in order to be able to determine it in a certain manner. Hence, in a conception of the pure understanding, the matter precedes the form, and for this reason Leibniz first assumed the existence of things, monads, and of an internal power of representation in them, in order to found upon this their external relation and the community of their state, that is, of their representations. Hence, with him, space and time were possible, the former through relation of substances, the latter through the connection of their determinations with each other as causes and effects. And so would it really be if the pure understanding were capable of an immediate application to objects, and if space and time were determinations of things in themselves. But being merely sensuous intuitions, in which we determine all objects solely as phenomena, the form of intuition, as a subjective property of sensibility, must antecede all matter, sensations. Consequently, space and time must antecede all phenomena and all data of experience, and rather make experience itself possible. But the intellectual philosopher could not endure that the form should proceed to things themselves and determine their possibility, an objection perfectly correct if we assume that we intuit things as they are, although with confused representation. But as sensuous intuition is a peculiar subjective condition, which is a priori at the foundation of all perception, and the form of which is primitive, the form must be given per se, and so far from matter, or the things themselves which appear, lying at the foundation of experience, as we conclude if we judge by mere conception, the very possibility of itself presupposes, on the contrary, a given formal intuition, space and time. End of appendix.
Section 19. The Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Transcendental Doctrine of Elements. Part 2nd. Transcendental Logic. First Division. Transcendental Analytic. Book 2. Transcendental Doctrine of the Faculty of Judgment, or Analytic of Principles. Chapter 3. Of the Ground of the Division of all Objects into Phenomena and Noumena. Appendix. Remark on the amphiboly of the conceptions of reflection.
Let me be allowed to term the position which we assign to a conception, either in the sensibility or in the pure understanding, the transcendental place. In this manner, the appointment of the position which must be taken by each conception according to the difference in its use, and the directions for determining this place to all conceptions according to rules, would be a transcendental topic, a doctrine which would thoroughly shield us from the surreptitious devices of the pure understanding and the delusions which thence arise, as it would always distinguish to what faculty of cognition each conception properly belonged. Every conception, every title, under which many cognitions rank together, may be called a logical place. Upon this is based the logical topic of Aristotle, of which teachers and rhetoricians could avail themselves, in order, under certain titles of thought, to observe what would best suit the matter they had to treat, and thus enable themselves to quibble and talk with fluency and an appearance of profundity. Transcendental topic, on the contrary, contains nothing more than the above-mentioned 4 titles, of all comparison and distinction, which differ from categories in this respect. They do not represent the object according to that which constitutes its conception, quantity, reality, but set forth merely the comparison of representations which precedes our conceptions of things. But this comparison requires a previous reflection, that is, a determination of the place to which the representations of the things which are compared belong, whether, to wit, they are cogitated by pure understanding or given by sensibility. Conceptions may be logically compared without the trouble of inquiring to what faculty their objects belong, whether as noumena to the understanding or as phenomena to sensibility. If, however, we wish to employ these conceptions in respect of objects, previous transcendental reflection is necessary. Without this reflection, I should make a very unsafe use of these conceptions and construct pretended synthetical propositions which critical reason cannot acknowledge, and which are based solely upon a transcendental amphiboly, that is, upon a substitution of an object of pure understanding for a phenomenon. For want of this doctrine of transcendental topic, and consequently deceived by the amphiboly of the conceptions of reflection, the celebrated Leibniz constructed an intellectual system of the world, or rather believed himself competent to cognize the internal nature of things, by comparing all objects merely with the understanding and the abstract formal conceptions of thought. Our table of the conceptions of reflection gives us the unexpected advantage of being able to exhibit the distinctive peculiarities of his system in all its parts, and at the same time of exposing the fundamental principle of this peculiar mode of thought, which rested upon naught but a misconception. He compared all things with each other merely by means of conceptions, and naturally found no other differences than those by which the understanding distinguishes its pure conceptions one from another. The conditions of sensuous intuition, which contain in themselves their own means of distinction, he did not look upon as primitive, because sensibility was to him but a confused mode of representation, and not any particular source of representations. A phenomenon was for him the representation of the thing in itself, although distinguished from cognition by the understanding only in respect of the logical form, the former with its usual want of analysis containing, according to him, a certain mixture of collateral representations in its conception of a thing, which it is the duty of the understanding to separate and distinguish. In one word, Leibniz intellectualized phenomena, just as Locke, in his system of nogony, if I may be allowed to make use of such expression, sensualized the conceptions of the understanding, that is to say, declared them to be nothing more than empirical or abstract conceptions of reflection, instead of seeking in the understanding and sensibility two different sources of representations, which, however, can present us with objective judgments of things only in conjunction. Each of these great men recognized but one of these faculties, which, in their opinion, applied immediately to the things in themselves, the other having no duty but that of confusing or arranging the representations of the former. Accordingly, the objects of sense were compared by Leibniz as things in general, merely in the understanding. First, he compares them in regard to their identity or difference as judged by the understanding. As therefore he considered merely the conceptions of objects and not their position in intuition, in which alone objects can be given, and left quite out of sight the transcendental locale of these conceptions, whether, that is, their object ought to be classed among phenomena or among things in themselves. It was to be expected that he should extend the application of the principle of indiscernibles, which is valid solely of conceptions of things in general, to objects of sense, mundus phenomenon, and that he should believe that he had thereby contributed in no small degree to extend our knowledge of nature. In truth, if I cognize in all its inner determinations a drop of water as a thing in itself, I cannot look upon one drop as different from another, if the conception of the one is completely identical with that of the other. But if it is a phenomenon in space, it has a place not merely in the understanding, among conceptions, but also in sensuous external intuition in space. And in this case, the physical locale is a matter of indifference in regard to the internal determinations of things, and one place, B, may contain a thing which is perfectly similar and equal to another in a place, A, just as well as if the two things were in every respect different from each other. Difference of place without any other conditions makes the plurality and distinction of objects as phenomena not only possible in itself, but even necessary. Consequently, the above so-called law is not a law of nature. It is merely an analytical rule for the comparison of things by means of mere conceptions. Second, the principle, quote, realities as simple affirmations never logically contradict each other, end quote, is a proposition perfectly true respecting the relation of conceptions, but whether as regards nature or things in themselves, of which we have not the slightest conception, is without any the least meaning. For real opposition in which A, B is equal 0 exists everywhere, an opposition that is in which one reality united with another in the same subject annihilates the effects of the other, a fact which is constantly brought before our eyes by the different antagonistic actions and operations in nature, which nevertheless, as depending on real forces, must be called realitates phenomena. General mechanics can even present us with the empirical condition of this opposition in an a priori rule, as it directs its attention to the opposition in the direction of forces, a condition of which the transcendental conception of reality can tell us nothing. Although M. Leibniz did not announce this proposition with precisely the pomp of a new principle, he yet employed it for the establishment of new propositions, and his followers introduced it into their Leibnizio-Wolffian system of philosophy. According to this principle, for example, all evils are but consequences of the limited nature of created beings, that is, negations, because these are the only opposite of reality. In the mere conception of a thing in general, this is really the case, but not in things as phenomena. In like manner, the upholders of this system deem it not only possible, but natural also, to connect and unite all reality in one thing, because they acknowledge no other sort of opposition than that of contradiction, by which the conception itself of a thing is annihilated, and find themselves unable to conceive an opposition of reciprocal destruction, so to speak, in which one real cause destroys the effect of another, and the conditions of whose representation we meet only in sensibility. Third, the Leibnizian monadology has really no better foundation than on this philosopher's mode of falsely representing the difference of the internal and external solely in relation to the understanding. Substances in general must have something inward, which is therefore free from external relations, consequently from that of composition also. The simple, that which can be represented by a unit, is therefore the foundation of that which is internal in things in themselves. The internal state of substances cannot therefore consist in place, shape, contact, or motion, determinations which are all external relations, and we can ascribe to them no other than that whereby we internally determine our faculty of sense itself, that is to say, the state of representation. Thus, then, were constructed the monads, which were to form the elements of the universe, the active force of which consists in representation, the effects of this force being thus entirely confined to themselves. For the same reason, his view of the possible community of substances could not represent it but as a predetermined harmony, and by no means as a physical influence. For inasmuch as everything is occupied only internally, that is, with its own representations, the state of the representations of one substance could not stand in active and living connection with that of another, but some third cause operating on all without exception was necessary to make the different states correspond with one another. And this did not happen by means of assistance applied in each particular case, systema assistentia, but through the unity of the idea of a cause occupied and connected with all substances, in which they necessarily receive, according to the Leibnizian school, their existence and permanence. consequently also reciprocal correspondence according to universal laws. Fourth, this philosopher's celebrated doctrine of space and time, in which he intellectualized these forms of sensibility, originated in the same delusion of transcendental reflection. If I attempt to represent by the mere understanding the external relations of things, I can do so only by employing the conception of their reciprocal action, and if I wish to connect one state of the same thing with another state, I must avail myself of the notion of the order of cause and effect. And thus Leibniz regarded space as a certain order in the community of substances, and time as the dynamical sequence of their states. That which space and time possesses, proper to themselves and independent of things, he ascribed to a necessary confusion in our conceptions of them, whereby that which is a mere form of dynamical relations is held to be self-existent intuition, antecedent even to things themselves. Thus space and time were the intelligible form of the connection of things, substances and their states, in themselves. But things were intelligible substances, substantia noumena. At the same time, he made these conceptions valid of phenomena, because he did not allow to sensibility a peculiar mode of intuition, but sought all, even the empirical representation of objects in the understanding, and left no sense naught but the despicable task of confusing and disarranging the representations of the former. But even if we could frame any synthetical proposition concerning things in themselves by means of the pure understanding, which is impossible, it could not apply to phenomena which do not represent things in themselves. In such a case, I should be obliged in transcendental reflection to compare my conceptions only under the conditions of sensibility, and so space and time would not be determinations of things in themselves, but of phenomena. What things may be in themselves I know not and need not know, because a thing is never presented to me otherwise than as a phenomenon. I must adopt the same mode of procedure with the other conceptions of reflection. Matter is substantia phenomenon. That in it which is internal I seek to discover in all parts of space which it occupies, and in all functions and operations it performs, and which are indeed never anything but phenomena of the external sense. I cannot therefore find anything that is absolutely, but only what is comparatively internal, and which itself consists of external relations. The absolutely internal in matter, and as it should be according to the pure understanding, is a mere chimera. For matter is not an object for the pure understanding. But the transcendental object, which is the foundation of the phenomenon which we call matter, is a mere nescio quid, the nature of which we could not understand, even though someone were found able to tell us. For we can understand nothing that does not bring with it something in intuition corresponding to the expression employed. If by the complement of being unable to perceive the internal nature of things, it is meant that we do not comprehend by the pure understanding what the things which appear to us may be in themselves. It is a silly and unreasonable complaint. For those who talk thus really desire that we should be able to cognize, consequently to intuit, things without senses, and therefore wish that we possessed a faculty of cognition perfectly different from the human faculty, not merely in degree, but even as regards intuition and the mode thereof, so that thus we should not be men, but belong to a class of beings, the possibility of whose existence, much less their nature and constitution, we have no means of cognizing. By observation and analysis of phenomena, we penetrate into the interior of nature, and no one can say what progress this knowledge may make in time. But those transcendental questions which pass beyond the limits of nature we could never answer, even although all nature were laid open to us, because we have not the power of observing our own mind with any other intuition than that of our internal sense. For herein lies the mystery of the origin and source of our faculty of sensibility, its application to an object, and the transcendental ground of this unity of subjective and objective lie too deeply concealed for us who cognize ourselves only through the internal sense. Consequently, as phenomena, to be able to discover in our existence anything but phenomena, the non-sensuous cause of which we at the same time earnestly desire to penetrate to. The great utility of this critique of conclusions arrived at by the process of mere reflection consists in its clear demonstration of the nullity of all conclusions respecting objects which are compared with each other in the understanding alone, while it at the same time confirms what we particularly insisted on, namely, that although phenomena are not included as things in themselves among the objects of the pure understanding, they are nevertheless the only things by which our cognition can possess objective reality, that is to say, which give us intuitions to correspond with our conceptions. When we reflect in a purely logical manner, we do nothing more than compare conceptions in our understanding to discover whether both have the same content, whether they are self-contradictory or not, whether anything is contained in either conception, which of the two is given, and which is merely a mode of thinking that given. But if I apply these conceptions to an object in general, in the transcendental sense, without first determining whether it is an object of sensuous or intellectual intuition, certain limitations present themselves which forbid us to pass beyond the conceptions and render all empirical use of them impossible. And thus these limitations prove that the representation of an object as a thing in general is not only insufficient, but without sensuous determination, and independently of empirical conditions, self-contradictory. That we must therefore make abstraction of all objects, as in logic, or admitting them, we must think them under conditions of sensuous intuition, that consequently the intelligible requires an altogether peculiar intuition, which we do not possess, and in the absence of which it is for us nothing. While on the other hand, phenomena cannot be objects in themselves. For when I merely think things in general, the difference in their external relations cannot constitute a difference in the things themselves. On the contrary, the former presupposes the latter, and if the conception of one of two things is not internally different from that of the other, I am merely thinking the same thing in different relations. Further, by the addition of one affirmation, reality, to the other, the positive therein is really augmented, and nothing is abstracted or withdrawn from it. Hence the real in things cannot be in contradiction with or opposition to itself, and so on. The true use of the conceptions of reflection in the employment of the understanding has, as we have shown, been so misconceived by Leibniz, one of the most acute philosophers of either ancient or modern times, that he has been misled into the construction of a baseless system of intellectual cognition, which professes to determine its objects without the intervention of the senses. For this reason, the exposition of the cause of the amphiboly of these conceptions, as the origin of these false principles, is of great utility in determining with certainty the proper limits of the understanding. It is right to say whatever is affirmed or denied of the whole of a conception can be affirmed or denied of any part of it, dictum de homini et nullo. But it would be absurd so to alter this logical proposition as to say whatever is not contained in a general conception is likewise not contained in the particular conceptions which rank under it. For the latter are particular conceptions for the very reason that their content is greater than that which is cogitated in the general conception. And yet the whole intellectual system of Leibniz is based upon this false principle, and with it must necessarily fall to the ground, together with all the ambiguous principles in reference to the employment of the understanding which have thence originated. Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles or indistinguishables is really based on the presupposition that if in the conception of a thing a certain distinction is not to be found, it is also not to be met with in things themselves, that consequently all things are completely identical, numero idem, which are not distinguishable from each other as to quality or quantity in our conceptions of them. But as in the mere conception of anything, abstraction has been made of many necessary conditions of intuition, that of which abstraction has been made is rashly held to be non-existent, and nothing is attributed to the thing but what is contained in its conception. The conception of a cubic foot of space, however I may think it, is in itself completely identical, but 2 cubic feet in space are nevertheless distinct from each other from the sole fact that their being in different places, they are numero diversa, and these places are conditions of intuition, wherein the object of this conception is given, and which do not belong to the conception, but to the faculty of sensibility. In like manner, there is in the conception of a thing no contradiction when a negative is not connected with an affirmative, and merely affirmative conceptions cannot, in conjunction, produce any negation. But in sensuous intuition, wherein reality, take for example motion, is given, we find conditions, opposite directions, of which abstraction has been made in the conception of motion in general, which render possible a contradiction or opposition, not indeed of a logical kind, and which from pure positives produce 0 equal 0. We are therefore not justified in saying that all reality is in a perfect agreement and harmony, because no contradiction is discoverable among its conceptions. Footnote 38. According to mere conceptions, that which is internal in the substratum of all relations or external determinations. When, therefore, I abstract all conditions of intuition and confine myself solely to the conception of a thing in general, I can make abstraction of all external relations, and there must, nevertheless, remain a conception of that which indicates no relation, but merely internal determinations. Now it seems to follow that in everything, substance, there is something which is absolutely internal and which antecedes all external determinations, inasmuch as it renders them possible, and that therefore is substratum in something which does not contain any external relations, and is consequently simple. For corporeal things are never anything but relations, at least of their parts, external to each other. And inasmuch as we know of no other absolutely internal determinations than those of the internal sense, this substratum is not only simple, but also, analogously with our internal sense, determined through representations. That is to say, all things are properly monads, or simple beings endowed with the power of representation. Now, all this would be perfectly correct if the conception of a thing were the only necessary condition of the presentation of objects of external intuition. It is, on the contrary, manifest that a permanent phenomenon in space, impenetrable extension, can contain mere relations and nothing that is absolutely internal, and yet be the primary substratum of all external perception. By mere conceptions, I cannot think anything external without at the same time thinking something internal, for the reason that conceptions of relations presuppose given things, and without these are impossible. But as an intuition there is something, that is space, which, with all it contains, consists of purely formal or indeed real relations, which is not found in the mere conception of a thing in general, and this presents to us the substratum which could not be recognized through conceptions alone. I cannot say, because a thing cannot be represented by mere conceptions without something absolutely internal, there is also in the things themselves, which are contained under these conceptions and in their intuition, nothing external to which something absolutely internal does not survive as the foundation. For when we have made abstraction of all the conditions of intuition, there certainly remains in the mere conception nothing but the internal in general, through which alone the external is possible. But this necessity, which is grounded upon abstraction alone, does not obtain in the case of things themselves, in so far as they are given in intuition with such determinations as express mere relations, without having anything internal as their foundation. For they are not things of a thing which we can neither, for they are not things in themselves, but only phenomena. What we cognize in matter is nothing but relations. What we call its internal determinations are but comparatively internal. But there are some self-subsistent and permanent through which a determined object is given. That I, when abstraction is made of these relations, have nothing more to think, does not destroy the conception of a thing as phenomenon, nor the conception of an object in abstracto, but it does away with the possibility of an object that is determinable according to mere conceptions, that is, of a nomenon. It is certainly startling to hear that a thing consists solely of relations, but this thing is simply a phenomenon and cannot be cogitated by means of the mere categories. It does itself consist in the mere relation of something in general to the senses. In the same way, we cannot cogitate relations of things in abstracto, if we commence with conceptions alone, in any other manner than that one is the cause of determinations in the other, for that is itself the conception of the understanding or category of relation. But as in this case we make abstraction of all intuition, we lose altogether the mode in which the manifold determines to each of its parts its place, that is, the form of sensibility, space, and yet this mode antecedes all empirical causality. Footnote 38. If anyone wishes here to have recourse to the usual subterfuge and to say that at least realities noumena cannot be in opposition to each other, it will be requisite for him to adduce an example of this pure and non-sensuous reality, that it may be understood whether the notion represents something or nothing. But an example cannot be found except in experience, which never presents to us anything more than phenomena, and thus the proposition means nothing more than that the conception which contains only affirmatives does not contain anything negative, a proposition nobody ever doubted. End footnote 38. If by intelligible objects we understand things which can be thought by means of pure categories without the need of the schemata of sensibility, such objects are impossible. For the condition of the objective use of all our conceptions of understanding is the mode of our sensuous intuition, whereby objects are given, and if we make abstraction of the latter, the former can have no relation to an object. And even if we should suppose a different kind of intuition from our own, still our functions of thought would have no use or significance in respect thereof. But if we understand by the term objects of a sensuous intuition in respect of which our categories are not valid, and of which we can accordingly have no knowledge, neither intuition nor conception, in this merely negative sense, noumena must be admitted. For this is no more than saying that our mode of intuition is not applicable to all things, but only to objects of our senses, that consequently its objective validity is limited, and that room is therefore left for another kind of intuition, and thus also for things that may be objects of it. But in this sense the conception of noumenon is problematical. That is to say, it is the notion of that it is possible, nor that it is impossible. Inasmuch as we do not know of a mode of intuition and a kind of conception, neither of which is applicable to a non-sensuous object, we are on this account incompetent to extend the sphere of our objects of thought beyond the conditions of our sensibility, and to assume the existence of objects of pure thought, that is, of noumena, inasmuch as these have no true positive signification. For it must be confessed of the categories that they are not of themselves sufficient for the cognition of things in themselves, and without the data of sensibility are mere subjective forms of the unity of the understanding. Thought is certainly not a product of the senses, and in so far is not limited by them. But it does not therefore follow that it may be employed purely and without the intervention of sensibility. For it would then be without reference to an object, and we cannot call a noumenon an object of pure thought, for the representation thereof is but the problematical conception of an object for a perfectly different intuition and a perfectly different understanding from ours, both of which are consequently themselves problematical. The conception of a noumenon is therefore not the conception of an object, but merely a problematical conception inseparably connected with the limitation of our sensibility. That is to say, the conception contains the answer to the question, quote, are there objects quite unconnected with and independent of our intuition, end quote. A question to which only an indeterminate answer can be given. That answer is, quote, inasmuch as sensuous intuition does not apply to all things without distinction, there remains room for other and different objects, end quote. The existence of these problematical objects is therefore not absolutely denied in the absence of the determinate conception of them, but as no category is valid in respect of them, neither must they be admitted as objects for our understanding. Understanding accordingly limits sensibility, without at the same time enlarging its own field, while moreover it forbids sensibility to apply its forms and modes to things in themselves, and restricts it to the sphere of phenomena. It cogitates an object in itself, only, however, as a transcendental object, which is the cause of a phenomenon, consequently not itself a phenomenon, and which cannot be thought either as a quantity or as reality, or as substance, because these conceptions always require sensuous forms in which to determine an object, therefore, of which we are quite unable to say whether it can be met with in ourselves or out of us, whether it would be annihilated together with sensibility, or, if this were taken away, would continue to exist. If we wish to call this object a noumenon, because the representation of it is non-sensuous, we are at liberty to do so. But as we can apply it to none of the conceptions of our understanding, the representation is for us quite void, and is available only for indication of the limits of our sensuous intuition, thereby leaving at the same time an empty space which we are competent to fill by the aid neither of possible experience nor of the pure understanding. The critique of the pure understanding accordingly does not permit us to create for ourselves a new field of objects beyond those which are presented to us as phenomena, and to stray into intelligible worlds. Nay, it does not even allow us to endeavor to form so much as a conception of them. The specious error which leads to this, and which is a perfectly excusable one, lies in the fact that the employment of the understanding, contrary to its proper purpose and destination, is made transcendental, and objects, that is, possible intuitions, are made to regulate themselves according to conceptions, instead of the conceptions arranging themselves according to the intuitions on which alone their own objective validity rests. Now the reason of this again is that apperception, and with it thought, antecedes all possible determinate arrangement of representations. Accordingly, we think something in general and determine it on the one hand sensuously, but on the other distinguish the general and in abstracto represented object from this particular mode of intuiting it. In this case, there remains a mode of determining the object by mere thought, which is really but a logical form without content, which, however, seems to us to be a mode of the existence of the object in itself, noumenon, without regard to intuition, which is limited to our senses. Before ending this transcendental analytic, we must make an addition, which, although in itself of no particular importance, seems to be necessary to the completeness of the system. The highest conception, with which a transcendental philosophy commonly begins, is the division into possible and impossible. But as all division presupposes a divided conception, a still higher one must exist, and this is the conception of an object in general. Problematically understood, and without its being decided whether it is something or not, as the categories are the only conceptions which apply to the objects in general, the distinguishing of an object, whether it is something or nothing, must proceed according to the order and direction of the categories. 1. To the categories of quantity, that is, the conceptions of all, many, and one, the conception which annihilates all, that is, the conception of none, is opposed. And thus the object of a conception to which no intuition can be found to correspond is equal nothing. That is, it is a conception without an object, ens rationis, like noumena, which cannot be considered possible in the sphere of reality, though they must not therefore be held to be impossible, or like certain new fundamental forces in matter, the existence of which is cogitable without contradiction, though, as examples from experience are not forthcoming, they must not be regarded as possible. 2. Reality is something, negation is nothing. That is, a conception of the absence of an object, as cold, a shadow, nihil privativum. 3. The mere form of intuition without substance is in itself no object, but the merely formal condition of an object, as phenomenon, as pure space and pure time. These are certainly something, as forms of intuition, but are not themselves objects which are intuited, ens imaginarium. 4. The object of a conception which is self-contradictory is nothing, because the conception is nothing, is impossible as a figure composed of two straight lines, nihil negativum. The table of this division of the conception of nothing, the corresponding division of the conception of something, does not require special description, must therefore be arranged as follows. Nothing as 1. As empty conception without object, ens rationis. 2, 3. Empty object of empty intuition, a conception without object, nihil privativum ens imaginarium. 4. Empty object without conception, nihil negativum. We see that the ens rationis is distinguished from the nihil negativum, or pure nothing, by the consideration that the former must be reckoned among possibilities, because it is a mere fiction, though not self-contradictory, while the latter is completely opposed to all possibility, inasmuch as the conception annihilates itself. Both, however, are empty conceptions. On the other hand, the nihil privativum and ens imaginarium are empty data for conceptions. If light be not given to the senses, we cannot represent to ourselves darkness, and if extended objects are not perceived, we cannot represent space. Neither the negation nor the mere form of intuition can, without something real, be an object. End of section 19. Recording by Robert Scott, mojomove411.com, mojomove411.com. September the 17th, 2007.